Before we dive into the stories and you begin to drift off to sleep, I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now sit back, relax, and let's begin. At the time, both my husband and I were 24 years old. Our daughter was 2, and we were on a road trip to visit family. About 20 minutes outside our hometown, there was a large gas station known for its wide selection of snacks. Every time we took a trip, we made it a habit to stop there for fuel, drinks, and snacks. It was a hot summer day, right in the middle of the afternoon when we pulled in, and my husband found a pump to refuel. Since we had all used the bathroom before leaving home, I left our daughter in the car while my husband filled the tank, and I headed inside to fill our water bottles and grab some snacks. This gas station was relatively big for the area, though not enormous. The bathrooms and the water fountain, which included a bottle-filling station, were located down a somewhat secluded hallway. With only one cashier working and a long line forming, I decided to purchase the snacks first. That way, I could fill the water bottles on my way out, just in case the line got even longer. While I was inside, my husband finished pumping gas and moved the car to a parking spot in front of the building to wait for me. However, since the windows were covered with posters and advertisements, I didn't really notice this. As I stood in line, holding our snacks and water bottles, 2 men immediately got in line behind me. They were tall. I'm about 5 feet 10 inches, which is considered fairly tall for a woman, but I'd estimate they were at least 6 feet. Their clothing was plain, khaki shorts and black or gray t-shirts. I didn't hear them speak any English, and while I can't say for certain what language they were speaking, it sounded Middle Eastern. I should also mention that they were Caucasian, not that their appearance or background matters, but I wanted to clarify in case anyone assumed I was making judgments. This wasn't particularly unusual, given that there was a large college town nearby. That said, ever since having my daughter, I've been uncomfortable with anyone standing too close behind me, even if they're family. I turned slightly, keeping them in my peripheral vision, and pretended to browse a display of kids' toys while waiting in line. This is something I often do in these situations, and normally, no one even notices or reacts. Most people stand still while waiting, but these guys were shifting around much more than usual. One of them was staring at me outright, and his expression was deeply unsettling. Since he hadn't actually done anything, I gave a small, polite smile, nodded slightly, and looked away, though I kept in my line of sight. They were whispering to each other in a language I didn't understand, which wasn't unusual on its own, but the fact that they kept staring directly at me, despite the store being fairly busy, made me uneasy. Then, they subtly adjusted their position so that they were standing directly behind me. For the next 4 minutes, I kept my eyes on my phone, but every time I shifted because I was uncomfortable, they would move to stay directly behind me again. When they looked at the items on display, it seemed unnatural, like they weren't genuinely interested in them. At one point, they even pretended to examine a unicorn toy multiple times, circling back to it at least 4 times. Their behavior felt forced, as if they were just using it as an excuse to reposition themselves behind me. I felt like I was crazy because, maybe one of them has a daughter or a niece who would like it or whatever, but every time I looked close enough, they were always staring at me, watching me. I was seriously freaked out, but I kept telling myself that they weren't after me or anything. But just to be safe, I decided not to go and fill the water bottles and to just go straight back to the car, and it just wasn't worth the risk. I was still 3 people away from the front of the line at this point. There was some sort of an issue with a membership card that held a lineup or something, and more people had lined up behind the men. One was a middle-aged woman and her teenage, 13 to 14-ish. The woman saw my discomfort and saw how they kept getting behind me over and over. So she sent her teenager to see if the self-checkouts were open. At this gas station, it was like a 50-50 chance that they were. What I mean is that they went down a lot. Meanwhile, those men were getting closer and closer. I'd already gotten as close to the person in front of me as socially allowed, but they were now breathing down my neck and even brushing up against me while they looked at the displays of candy and unicorn toys. I was contemplating leaving the snacks on the counter and just walking out. When the teenager came back and must have whispered to the woman that the self-checkout was open, then the woman walked up to me, took me by my arm, and led me to the self-checkout. We watched each other's backs while we checked out. I looked up and saw them still staring at me. And this time they looked really angry. They were about to come and talk to me, it seemed, when she grabbed my bag and receipt for me and walked me out to my car. Somehow she was just so smooth with everything. I don't even think her teenager noticed what was going on. Once I stepped outside, I immediately spotted our car with my husband and daughter inside. I helped my little one and jokingly thanked her for helping me get out of there. After that, we went our separate ways. I told my husband everything that had happened, keeping my emotions in check and just explaining their behavior and actions. Even so, he was just as unsettled as I was and wished he had been able to personally thank the woman who had helped me. Since I hadn't been able to fill our water bottles, we stopped at another gas station to do so. About 6 months later, we ended up moving away from that area. That woman truly felt like a hero to me, and I'll always be grateful she was there that day. It's hard to put into words just how deeply unsettling the entire situation was. I was genuinely afraid that those men might follow me to my car, and if they had, I have no idea what I would have done. Moving on to the next story. For context, I'm female, and at the time I was around 19 years old. This happened years ago when I was out walking my dog. Because I worked late, I usually had to take him out after dark. Despite that, I rarely felt unsafe, even though my dog Reese had a very mild temperament and wasn't the type to protect me in a dangerous situation. This took place in a middle-class suburban neighborhood in Texas, where I had been walking my dogs my whole life. I remember that it had rained recently, and the yard lights that most houses kept on at night were reflecting off the puddles, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. I'm not sure if anyone else has experienced this, but sometimes yard lights actually make it harder to see at night. The bright areas are visible, but the light creates sharp contrasts, making the shadows beyond it feel even darker. With the reflections in the puddles, my vision felt distorted, and it was difficult to see into the unlit areas. Despite being in a well-populated neighborhood, most people were asleep or quietly inside by that time, which made my walks feel surprisingly solitary. Occasionally, I'd come across another quiet dog walker, but it wasn't an every-night occurrence, and when it did happen, I'd usually only see one person. While Reese never reacted to passing people or dogs, my previous dog had been much more reactive, sometimes barking uncontrollably at both. That experience had trained me to stay aware of my surroundings, ready to turn down a cul-de-sac or change routes to avoid unnecessary commotion. Even though my old dog had passed, that habit stuck with me. So as I walked along, gazing at the stars and letting my mind wander, I suddenly noticed what looked like a shadowy movement up the road. It was too far away to make out clearly, but regardless, there wasn't anywhere for me to turn. I kept walking while Reese remained absorbed in sniffing every mailbox we passed. I should mention that this was a two-way street, just a single lane in each direction, with no sidewalks. I hadn't seen a single car all night. By this point, I could tell that the figure ahead was an adult walking toward me, without a dog. Normally, in such darkness, I wouldn't be able to tell if someone was approaching or moving away, but the reflection on their glasses gave them away. With no side streets to turn onto, and not wanting to double back and end up with this person following me for the rest of my walk, I decided it was best to just pass them and get it over with. Visibility was still poor, but I was now fairly certain that this person was a tall man. I couldn't say exactly what made me come to that conclusion, but the thought crossed my mind. He was a lone man, and I was a lone woman. Even though we were technically surrounded by houses, the situation felt eerily isolating. Reese was with me, and of course, I loved him. But as I'd mentioned before, I wasn't sure if he'd actually protect me if something happened. That thought hit me suddenly, completely out of nowhere. We were now just moments away from passing each other. The man and I were moving in opposite directions, staying on our respective sides of the road. Just as we reached the point of passing, Reese's ears suddenly perked up, and he pulled on his leash toward the stranger, his tail held high and alert. At that exact moment, the man stopped walking and did something that seemed small, yet was incredibly unsettling. He began walking backward, perfectly matching my pace. That was all it took for Reese to completely lose control. He started barking furiously and yanking at his leash with an intensity one had never seen before or since. My brain is just kind of jumping around with being confused, embarrassed at my poorly behaved dog. I'm struggling to control him, and weirdly, I'm also scared, I think. Like, my hair is standing on end for reasons that I really just cannot explain. Like, instinct is screaming that this isn't okay, while I stare at the shadowy figure walking silently backwards at an alarmingly fast pace as well. Head turned slightly towards me, glasses reflecting yard lights. We finally reached a section of the road that opened up into a better lit area with more traffic, and without thinking, I quickly pulled Reese down that path. After walking a few feet, I glanced over my shoulder to check on the man, but saw nothing. It was either too dark to spot him on the shadowy street, or he had simply disappeared. I couldn't tell which, but Reese immediately stopped his barking as soon as we made the sudden turn. However, he kept his gaze fixed on the road we had come from, acting strangely alert and restless throughout the rest of our walk home. Naturally, I was freaked out, so I took the quickest route home as fast as I could. I never saw that man again, and to this day, I really don't know what to make of the whole encounter. I've heard theories, like it could have been a skinwalker or maybe just some jerk messing with me. Maybe it was something else entirely. I really don't have a clue, but I'd love to hear any thoughts or theories you might have. If you're enjoying the stories so far, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. Moving on to the next story. When I was 4, my mother was in a tough situation, so I lived with my grandma from the age of 4 to 8. I clearly remember the first time I experienced something strange. I was in bed, talking to my grandparents, when I suddenly felt this almost magnetic pull to look toward the hallway. The door was made of wood with large holes in the design, so I could see a little through it. I can't quite explain why, but I felt like I had to look out there. It was a really odd feeling. When I did look, as strange as it sounds, I saw a blue ring open up, almost like a portal, and a tall, completely black figure stepped out. It was pitch black, no eyes, no features, just a human-shaped silhouette in the darkest color I had ever seen. It walked out of my view, and I immediately told my grandparents, nearly breaking down in fear. Despite my grandma being deeply interested in the paranormal, she didn't believe me when I told her about what I had seen. I had several encounters, though I can only remember 4 of them since I was so young. To be honest, my whole childhood feels like a fever dream, mostly due to mental struggles, but I want to clarify that I'm not schizophrenic or imagining things. These experiences were real, and they had to be real. That first encounter was just one of many. The next one I remember was with a white figure. I'm not sure of the exact order, but I do recall walking into the bedroom and not noticing it right away. When I did see it, the light it emitted was almost blinding, yet it still had a sort of dimness to it, making it hard to describe. It looked similar to the black figure in terms of height and features, tall, with no discernible features at all. But with this one, I felt an overwhelming sense of protection. It almost seemed like it was trying to warn me about something. I was close enough to touch it, but as a kid, even with that feeling of safety, I instinctively ran out of the room. I went and got my grandparents, but again, they didn't believe me. Now, the next time I can remember, it was in the middle of the night, maybe around 2 or 3 in the morning, and I got up to use the restroom walking into the bathroom. And it was just sitting there on the toilet with the seat down, and it looked at me. It didn't have eyes, but I could tell that it was looking at me because it moved its head in a sort of way to acknowledge me. I instantly ran out, told my grandparents, and at this point, almost every other day, I told them about it. He still didn't believe me, but I had a dream that night which I can remember as good as these encounters. My grandpa went to open the bathroom, and it was connected to the kitchen, and so was the bedroom. And the shadow person lunged at him and stabbed him in the neck, but there was no blood, and the thing had no knife or anything. It was holding something, but I couldn't see it. And it was a terrifying dream, and probably one of the worst ones that I'd ever had. After which, I told them that I would never be going to the bathroom again at night. Anyway, a week or two or some point after the dream and the encounter in the bathroom, I woke up one night and had to use the restroom and pleaded for them to come with me. However, since you could literally see the bathroom from the bedroom door, they just sat up and told me that I'd be fine. I walked out and slowly opened the bathroom door. As I got a glimpse into the bathroom, there was one standing there like it was waiting for me. I literally get chills talking about this because, as absurd as it sounds, it knew that I was coming. It was waiting for me. I'm sure of it. I ran back to the bedroom and stayed up the entire night next to my grandparents under a blanket. I cannot vividly remember any more encounters after this, but there were definitely some more. It was happening at least weekly at this stage, and my grandma recently passed. And when I moved out when I was like 8, around the time that I was 12, she actually told me that she was sorry for never believing me and that, apparently, she had seen one as well. She told me that she was laying on the couch, and we had a porch, but it was like it had walls. And I don't know the name for that sort of a room, but we walked into the house and there was that room, and then actually into the house and it was the living room. But through the door from that room to the living room, she said that she saw one staring at her through the window. She obviously got up and looked, and when she did, it wasn't there. Ever since then, she's always believed me as well any time that I saw one. But that's another weird thing, I guess. I never saw them again after I moved out when I was out of there. Maybe like one in the corner of my eye, perhaps, but I chalked that up to my imagination. There was never a vivid sighting of them in the same room as me like it was before. In fact, I still haven't seen anything, and I'm much older than that now. My mother told me about a week ago, though, which is why I'm sharing this now, that my grandpa had actually seen one a long time ago as well, and never really told anyone, and was just telling her for the first time. But he refused to go into any sort of detail at all, and also gets mad if you ask about the details, which is odd to me being that I've seen these before and he knows that. But that's my experience with these things. And every time that I saw them besides the white one, I felt pure terror, unlike any kind of scared feeling that I've ever felt before. Also, as a bit of a side note, my family has a bit of a history of weird things happening to them. My great-grandma had a dream where she was attacked by something and woke up with marks all over her arm. In her house, everyone in the family says that there was a ghost in the basement. It's interesting because despite my grandma not smoking, we would always smell cigars and we'd coming from down in the basement. My mom, grandpa, great-grandma, and grandma all said there was something down there too. My mom also had things moved around in her old houses, paintings or things in her closet that belonged to my father, who passed away when I was only 3 months old. She said she never touched them. So I guess it's nice to know I'm not the only one in the family who's seen or experienced strange things. I've never come across a story about shadow people that also involved something like the portal I described earlier, which is a bit unusual, I know. But I wanted to share my experiences. Moving on to the next story. When I first started working at the gas station, everything was fine. I didn't close much at first, and the fact that we closed at 11 was pretty nice. It was a comfortable routine, and things went smoothly for the most part. In order to get more hours, I decided to start taking closing shifts. My first closing shift, my manager had me work in the cooler, which was a big walk-in with shelves on one side for backstock, and the backs of the soda shelves on the other side, leading into the main store. By this point, I'd heard a lot of ghost stories from both past and current employees who worked closing shifts regularly. I didn't put much stock into them, though. I thought maybe they were just tired or letting their imaginations run wild, since the job isn't exactly thrilling, aside from the occasional difficult customer. But one night, while I was in the cooler with an AirPod in, listening to music, I started to get this uneasy feeling. I was convinced that either my music was glitching or I was hearing someone else in the cooler with me. It wasn't voices, but more like body noises, things like sniffling, deep breaths, scratching sounds, and the occasional sound of feet sliding. Every time I would investigate, there was never anyone there. This continued for weeks, as I began closing more often. To add to the eerie feeling, the lights at my store are on a timer to save on power. Every 15 minutes or so, I had to open the cooler door and hit the light button again. I had become really familiar with the layout of the cooler after walking through it so many times, usually guided by just the glow of the outside lights peeking through the soda shelves. But on this particular night, the air felt different. It was almost as if the light was being suppressed, darker than usual when the lights were off, like the air itself was thick and heavy. After the third time going through the cooler to reset the lights, I accidentally bumped into something I thought was the corner of the last shelf before the cooler turned, but I swear I was nowhere near it. What I actually hit felt almost soft, like when you bring two magnets too close and they repel each other. It wasn't a hard bump, but more like a gentle push from something unseen. Right after that, I felt a sharp drop in temperature. The cooler was cold, of course, but this was a different kind of cold, like the kind you'd feel if you were outside in freezing temperatures for hours with barely any clothes. My core felt like it was freezing solid. It was suddenly hard to breathe, and I felt this intense sensation like I hadn't eaten in days. Like I hadn't ate for months, but as fast as that feeling overcame me, it passed and I was back to normal. Well, days later, I am doing an opening shift on a Sunday. In the South, many stores are closed on Sundays because of church, and the few that are open have little to no customers because of the reasons stated. It's about 5 a.m., and I'm brewing the teas for the day. And my general manager is sitting in the office doing our morning paperwork, adjusting gas prices, etc. She pops out to tell me that she has to run to the main grocery store to grab some things for our shelves. This part of the opening always scared me because I see those robbing videos on Twitter all the time, or X as it's now referred to. And we cannot lock the door with only one staff member inside, so I just continue on finishing the open tasks. It's pitch black outside and almost darker past the shelves on the cooler. While the last tea is brewing, I have a quick memory of the last guy that I had served the night before. He had gotten 4 Budweiser tall boys, and I went to push up the rest of the beer behind him in preparation for the Sunday football rush around noon. And as I reached my hand to the back of the column, I felt a cold, soft, and almost childlike hand rest on top of mine. I immediately snapped my hand back, now freezing out of the cooler dragging about 12 beers with it, and ran to the front door to wait for my manager. I reasoned that surely it was just my brain. I mean, I was tired, but I swear that I could have seen a shadow, or maybe like an aura is a better way to put it, or something through the small crack illuminated by the little light that there was in the store. When my manager arrived, I held it together until we got to the office. While I was tearing up and telling her everything, something really strange happened. Brown liquid started leaking under the door. The office was next to the insect counter, where there was a standing teapot. I opened the door, and to my surprise, the teapot was still dispensing boiling water, even though the tea urn was already full. The tea filter had fallen to the floor, and the brown liquid tea, as we later realized, had spilled all over the store. We reviewed the security footage, but we couldn't find anything that explained it. It was just one of those weird, unexplainable things. I have more stories, some from coworkers, that I'd be happy to share at another time. I just wanted to tell you about this one because it's always stuck with me and made me feel so uncomfortable. Moving on to the next story. I'm a woman from a small town in British Columbia, Canada. My story takes place between February 2016 and February 2017. While I can't recall the exact months, I do know it happened in the fall, about 2 weeks into my time working at the community school. The first few paranormal experiences occurred in the broad office, which was just a minute's walk from the back of the school. I was sure I was alone in the office because I always checked beforehand to avoid scaring anyone who might be working late. After confirming no one was inside, I went downstairs, where there was a meeting room used for storage, open space for shelves holding files, and a washroom tucked away in the back corner. I usually start by cleaning the washroom before heading upstairs to clean the offices. I grab the trash and tidy up. On one particular occasion, as I was leaving the washroom, I heard a woman's voice swearing at me from my right. I had wired earphones hanging off my ear, so I could still hear the music. I knew the playlist well, and this wasn't one of the songs. I turned to look over my shoulder and saw no one in the dark corner. My heart nearly stopped when I realized I was alone. I quickly rushed back upstairs, trying to calm myself down. Once I regained my composure, I went back to cleaning, but as I walked around, I glanced out the windows to see if someone had been outside, but there was no one. Another time, when I went to clean the broad office in October, it was getting dark earlier, which added to the eerie feeling. I started by cleaning the offices before heading down to the washroom. After finishing up in the washroom, I swept the floors downstairs. While I was sweeping, I heard footsteps coming from the stairs. I always make sure to lock the door when I'm in the broad office, but then I heard the door unlock, open, and then close. I called out to let whoever had entered know I was cleaning and apologized if I startled them, but there was no response. No other footsteps. No answer. Thinking they hadn't heard me, I called out again. I even walked up and said hello, but there was still nothing. I went to the front door to check, but no one was there. However, I noticed that the door was unlocked, even though I was certain I had locked it when I entered. At that point, I decided to just finish up and grab the garbage in the hallway. As I looked up toward the back offices, I saw that one of the doors was now slammed shut. I quickly ran out, locked the door behind me, and headed back to the school, feeling so shaken that I had a panic attack. I called someone to go check the broad office after that, but they helped me calm down and they checked everything out. But in the end, there was nobody there. On another occasion, I was on my dinner break, sitting at the table on the side of the doorway. I was having my dinner and I was watching something on YouTube. I honestly can't remember what I was watching, but I do know that it wasn't too loud when all of a sudden I heard a few soft knocks on a door in the hallway. So I paused the video, looked out the doorway to see if someone that needed me for something, but again, there was nobody there. So uneasy now. I sat there listening to see if it happens again for about a minute. Then as I go to unpause the video, I heard scratching on the door right across the hallway from the office. I got up to walk over to the furnace room door, holding onto my phone in case I had to call my manager. As I got close, I said hello. You shouldn't be in there, right? Grabbed onto the doorknob to open it up, but it was locked. But it sounded like someone or something was moving around on the other side. So I started to call my manager, and as he picked up, there was a loud bang on the door. I jumped back at that as I kind of yelled into the phone, telling him what I thought was going on. I know that there is another way into the furnace room, but you would need to break in to be honest. And yes, my manager heard the bang as well. I then heard movement right behind the door, and it was in place, not going down the stairs. I tried to open the door again, yelling that you can't be in there. You have to leave now or I'll have to call the cops. The door opened this time and I quickly swung it open the rest of the way. But when I did, there was nothing. The lights were off that whole time too, so I flicked them on then looked down to see what I can only describe as a shadow person's head leaning over from the corner, quickly pulling back to hide. It was so weird because the lights were so bright that I should have seen her face clearly, but it was just a completely black shape. I closed the door to wait a few minutes for my manager to show up. I was shaking the whole time thinking back on what had just happened. The manager went to check things out, and then when he came back up to tell me that there was no one down there, everything was apparently locked and nothing was broken. Another time on dinner break, one of my guy friends was covering one of the other janitors at the time. We were in the same office having our dinner. We were watching our own videos on our phones while eating. Yes, I already told him what happened to me. He's not a big horror fan like I am, though. While sitting there eating, I heard a long scratch on a door. Couldn't tell where it came from, but had a hunch where it was. I looked at him and asked, "Did you hear that?" He nodded, looking absolutely shocked, so I paused my video. I opened a Spirit Box app that I had on my phone, and I started it. Yes, I was young and curious, wanting to find out whatever was there wanted to tell us. And after a few seconds, a few random words popped up. I don't remember all the words, but what stays with me to this day is angry, stairs, and fire. We looked at each other freaking out a little bit, Then we looked towards the door. As I stood up, the door opened slightly, so I told him to have the manager dial to his phone just in case. I ran over to pull the door open, but again, I saw and heard nothing. The lights were left on this time, though. My friend slowly walked over as I stepped through the door to look down, but there was no one there this time. But I did hear footsteps running into one of the rooms down there. So I started to go down the stairs yelling, "Hey, you need to get out of here." Then I told my friend to call the manager. As I got to the corner, I saw one of the doors closing. It was a slow closing door, mind you. Before I could open it again, it was fully closed and, weirdly enough, locked as well. I yelled while knocking on the door, "Hey, who was in there? You need to leave." I heard no movement for a bit while I tried to open the door, but then I heard a loud bang behind me from another door, like someone was using both of their arms. And it was at this stage that I thought to myself, to heck with this. I started running back up the stairs, telling my friend to watch my back in case someone tries to come after me. As I approached my friend, he told me that he had seen the same thing I did earlier, but this time the figure's arm was reaching out toward us. Just as I stepped onto the top stair, the light suddenly went out. Luckily, my friend quickly moved back into the hallway, so I ran out and quickly closed the door, holding it shut just as our manager arrived. We explained what had happened, and he went to check things out, but as usual, nothing seemed off. However, this time there were small, soft scratches on the furnace room door that hadn't been there before. I have more stories from this place, but for now, this will have to do since, believe it or not, I have to go back there for work. Moving on to the next story. A few years ago, I spent 5 months in rehab for a drug addiction, followed by another 6 months of sober living. The incident I'm about to share happened during the last few weeks of my time in rehab before transitioning to sober living. During my time there, I met hundreds of addicts. New people came in and out daily, some in far worse shape than others. Each person had their own struggles, whether it was addiction, mental health issues, or something else. Many of them had severe conditions like depression, PTSD, or bipolar disorder. One of the most unforgettable moments happened the day Mike, a man in his 30s or 40s, was admitted. The staff at the rehab made sure to inform all the patients about Mike and his condition. He had severe schizophrenia, which caused him to constantly talk to people who weren't there. He often became very agitated and upset by the voices, leading to frequent panic attacks. It was truly heartbreaking, and unfortunately, this wasn't a rare occurrence for Mike. It was something he struggled with every single day, 24/7. The rehab facility was located in an old motel-like building, with rooms shared by 2 or 3 other patients. When Mike arrived, he was placed in the same unit as me. I introduced myself and shook his hand. He seemed shy and nervous, so I took the opportunity to explain how everything worked, including the daily schedule. I showed him to his room and reassured him that if he ever needed anything, he shouldn't hesitate to ask me. Before I left his room, I told Mike, "We're all here for our own reasons. I just want you to know there's no judgment from me, and no matter what you're going through, you can come to me and confide in me about anything." He gave a small grin and nodded, but that was the last time we spoke during the 2 weeks he was at the rehab. That evening, I was sitting in the living room of our unit watching TV when I started hearing Mike talking to himself. The strange part was that it didn't sound like just random muttering. It sounded like he was having a full conversation. I heard him say, "Don't say that. Shut up." And then just a few seconds later, "I'm not going to do that. Leave me alone." And then a few seconds after that, "Get out of here." This was expected because I was informed of his condition, but hearing him have an episode the first time made me feel, well, really bad for him. But then things took a very odd turn over the following days. A few days after Mike was placed in my unit, I woke up one morning to go make some coffee. I was in the kitchen and Mike's room was down the hallway. I was pulling out a coffee filter when I heard clear as day, "What are you doing?" I turn around expecting to see Mike, but no one was there. Then I hear Mike all the way from the room scream, "Get out of here." I was very confused and didn't know what to make of it and kind of just shrugged it off. I was pretty alarmed by this, though, but things kept happening. It was later in the week when I was in the living room watching TV again when I heard Mike having another conversation with himself, but this time I could distinctly hear a second voice. I thought to myself, does he have a split personality and is having a conversation between himself and his other self? The other voice was so much different, and I kept telling myself, Mike's just really, really good at imitating other voices or something. I turned the volume down on the TV so that I could hear more of this conversation. Mike says, I told you no. I'm not going to do that. Leave me alone, please. The other voice responds, just go and do what I tell you. It's for the best. Mike responds, no. That's bad. I won't do it. The other voice then responds, go to the kitchen and get the knife now. Then Mike let out a huge scream of despair. I sat there on that couch in just disbelief. My brain couldn't comprehend what I was hearing or what was happening. I suddenly got a huge sense of dread that came over me. I got up and started making my way to his door to check on him. And as I got closer, the conversation was becoming much more audible and clear to hear. There were two people in that room. I was absolutely certain that I wasn't imagining it, and nothing will ever change my mind about that. As I heard the other voice trying to persuade Mike again, I knocked on his door, and as soon as I did, the voice stopped. I opened the door to check on him, wanting to make sure he was okay after hearing him scream. When I walked in, it was just Mike sitting in a chair, his head in his hands, like he had just received some devastating news. He looked up at me and said, I'm fine. Thanks. Please shut the door. Moving on to the next story. I worked the overnight shift at a residential treatment facility for troubled youth. Our original facility was out in the country, and it had once been a hunting cabin before being renovated and expanded for its current purpose. That facility recently closed down, and we moved to a more centrally located building in the city, which used to serve as a home for young mothers. I've had several experiences at both locations. Despite my history with paranormal events, I don't usually jump to conclusions and assume every strange occurrence is supernatural, especially with my graveyard shift hours. Sometimes I attribute it to fatigue or other factors, but my experiences were validated after sharing them with coworkers who've been there much longer than I have. In our old facility, from my office, I had a clear view down the hallway, where the clients' rooms were located. One night around 4 a.m., while I was doing some paperwork, I caught a glimpse of a pale shape or figure in the corner of my eye. It emerged quickly from one of the rooms, then darted back inside without making a sound. Since I wear glasses, my peripheral vision is blurry, so I assumed it was probably one of the clients. However, it struck me as strange because the clients don't wear anything light-colored like that, and it was odd that someone would dart out and back in so quickly in the middle of the night. It seemed suspicious, so I immediately got up and rushed to the doorway to check on the clients. It only took me about 5 seconds to get there, but when I did, all the clients were clearly sound asleep. There was no way anyone could have gotten out of bed, into the hallway, and back into bed so quickly without making a sound. The building is old enough that I would have heard even the faintest noise, like a client shifting in their bed. That was the most obvious incident. But there were other times when I saw shadowy figures out of the corner of my eye. They vanished so quickly when I looked directly at them that I couldn't be sure if they were real or just my imagination. There was also a time when a set of curtains rustled and moved slightly by themselves, even though there was no draft to explain it. I checked thoroughly to figure out what could have caused the curtains to move. There were no vents nearby, all the windows were shut and locked, and there was no wind outside that day. Plus, nothing else near the curtains had moved. When I mentioned what I had seen to a coworker, they just laughed it off and told me it was probably the lady in white. Apparently, multiple staff members and clients over the years have reported seeing a female figure in white. I have no idea who she could be, but that's the story. I've also heard tales of kitchen cabinets opening and closing by themselves, books flying off shelves, and several sightings of shadow figures. At our new facility, which used to be a home for young mothers, the activity has quieted down a lot. However, this place definitely has its own share of spooky happenings. On one of my first nights here, I heard footsteps in the hallway approaching the office. In this facility, the office is on the corner, and you can't really see anything from inside except the opposite hallway wall. You have to leave the office to see down either hallway. So I assumed it was a client awake and about to ask for something. I peeked my head out the door, but when I did, there was nobody there. The footsteps sounded light and fast, though like a child's perhaps. This facility is very well lit even at night, and if someone were approaching the office, you could see their shadow on the wall before you actually saw them. And one night, I swore that I saw what looked like a person's shadow moving across the wall in the way that you'd expect an actual person to follow. So again, I peeked my head out, but there was no one there. A couple of other times, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the edge of a figure passing by the office window as if they just passed by and were going down the hall. Both times, what little I saw of the figure before it disappeared just sort of appeared black and adult-sized, I guess. I've also heard footsteps a couple of other times, including with a new coworker who I was training one night. That was kind of nice, honestly, because I knew for sure that it wasn't just my imagination and me going crazy, as he definitely heard them too and got freaked out by it like I did. In any case, I related these occurrences to my new supervisor, who has worked in this building for a long time. They shrugged them off and just stated very matter-of-factly that the building is haunted. Before my current company took over management of this facility, it had previously been run by a Catholic religious organization, and it had been staffed by nuns. My supervisor shared with me that they, along with others, have seen figures of nuns in the hallways, as well as the apparition of a young girl. I think this might be the source of the childlike footsteps I've been hearing. Before any of my experiences here started, my supervisor did warn me that I'd likely hear strange noises at night, but that they were usually nothing to be concerned about. Honestly, none of these things have really freaked me out much. I just find them weird, interesting, and even a bit amusing. I actually enjoy working in a place where other coworkers have experienced similar things. It makes me feel less alone, and I don't have to worry about people thinking I'm crazy or lying if I share my experiences. This is the first job I've had where paranormal occurrences are so common and actually believed. I wonder if it's related to the negative energy surrounding the troubled clients. I can't say for sure, but this is the story I have, and I stand by it. Moving on to the next story. I'll start by describing a few things. I was in the car with my brothers when our mom pulled into our grandmother's driveway. She wanted to check on her because there had been recent concerns. Our grandma hadn't been answering anyone, which had everyone worried. Now here's where things took a turn for the eerie. There were hundreds, maybe thousands, of broken nutshells scattered all over her front porch. She always had the lights on inside her house after dark. But here's the strange part. This time the house was pitch black. No lights were visible through any of the blinds, which was very unusual. As we pulled in, I suddenly felt this heavy dread settle in my stomach, and a sour taste filled my mouth. It was as if something was off, and it hit me all at once. My mom turned the radio down and told us to stay in the car. I wasn't planning on going inside anyway. It was just too unsettling. She walked up to the door and tried the screen door, but it was locked. No big deal, right? But then she knocked, and when she did, the inner door opened so quickly, it was as if our grandmother had been waiting just behind it. That gave me chills. And when I looked at our grandmother, she appeared to be several inches taller than usual. It was bizarre. My mom stepped inside, and the door shut behind her. That pit in my stomach transformed into a full-on feeling of dread. My brother and I exchanged a look, both of us sharing the same chills. For whatever reason, that evening, the house just felt evil. That's the best way that I can put it. Now, after a few minutes of mentally wanting her to get the heck out of there, she storms out and gets in the car, and we pull out. The next few minutes down the road were tense. She seemed mad, annoyed. That's what we thought she was anyway. But then she starts crying, and now we're confused. So we're asking if something happened. She starts to tell us about what happened, and apparently there were no lights on in the house. None at all. Our grandmother goes through the archway in the dark with no problems. Mind you, she has bad hips and she's really clumsy, but she wasn't grabbing the rails on the wall for help or anything this time, nor did my mom smell any cat urine. I know that's odd, but her house has 3 cats in a litter box that is difficult to clean, so it really should smell. I mean, it always does, but not this time. Instead, my mom smells floral scents like lily and lilac, and a bit of lavender perhaps everywhere as well. Then my grandmother stands in the middle of the living room with her arms neatly together. In the darkness still, mind you, while my mom tries to turn on a light, but the light bulbs just were all taken out. Now, this was just beyond reasonable, because she couldn't have removed them without any help. The floral scent got worse the closer she got to her, and the room was really stuffy, hot, even dark, and our grandmother didn't want any lights on apparently. The couch was against the heater, and the heater wasn't even on. The blanket on the couch was neatly folded like it hadn't been used. All signs of the cats were gone, too. My mother said there was this, heavy weight on her chest when she was in there, like someone was pushing her chest in, and the way that she spoke apparently was just wrong. She called our mom dear, not sweetie or honey, but dear, and my mom wanted to give her a goodbye hug. And this is where things got even worse. My mother is taller than her, and so she has her arms over my grandmother's naturally. But this time when my mom hugged her, she was shorter than my grandmother. And she said that she looked younger, like there were fewer wrinkles in age, and that it felt like she was hugging a stranger. Bear in mind, too, that my grandmother has been collecting these blue glass things, pretty little things when there isn't any dust on them, and these prize things were apparently now in a box broken, and the box was shoved against a wall. The next thing was that she always only had a single tooth, but when she talked, my mom said that there is now a full set of teeth. Mind you, she doesn't have any money to get any fake teeth or anything. That night, when my mom practically ran out of the house, my grandmother just stood there, staring at us as we left in the darkness. It was so unsettling. I knew her dementia had been getting worse, but this was beyond what I could explain. Dementia makes people forget things over time, sure, but it doesn't cause you to suddenly gain height, have more teeth, rip out all the light bulbs, or look like you've turned back the clock by 30 years. I honestly can't make any sense of it. We don't know what's going on with her, and we really need some help understanding what's happening. It's like everything we thought we knew about her has been completely turned upside down. Moving on to the next story. I work as a child care professional, and one of the kids I care for had recently developed an interest in hiking. I decided to take him on a cool trail at Salt Fork State Park, where we planned to hike the Hossack's Cave. We parked near the trailhead, ready for the adventure. The trail is about half a mile long, which made it a perfect choice for our hike that day. I had picked this trail because in the past, it had always been busy, with lots of people around, which made me feel comfortable. However, after a series of severe summer storms, the trail had suffered significant damage. To my surprise, the trail was completely empty, making it feel eerie. Despite the emptiness, I wasn't too concerned because I noticed a small construction crew working on a bridge in the distance, just visible from the trailhead. My hiking companion was still eager to go, even though the trail was now barely a foot wide in some places, with a drop of 6 to 12 feet down to the creek bed. The trail was filled with solid rock and several fallen trees, but my companion was very athletic, and I had full confidence in his abilities. He was also excited about the adventure, so we pushed forward. We made it to a platform that provided a great view of the entire cave. Many trees surrounded the platform, and it had actually been closed off, but since we had already made it this far, we decided to carefully maneuver around the platform and continue the short distance into the cave. We spent the most time in this area due to the difficulty, so I got a good look at everything. There were tree roots beneath the platform, and you could climb up or down on either side of them. It's also worth mentioning that Hossack's Cave isn't the kind of dark, eerie cave you might imagine. It's more like a cliff with an overhanging rock formation and a small waterfall trickling down the middle. The place was open, beautiful, and serene. Once we reached the cave, I noticed a candle sitting on a large rock with a heart carved into it. The candle had clearly been used recently, but wasn't burning at the time. I assumed it was from someone having a romantic moment and didn't think much of it. He wanted to climb up to the top where I noticed two more candles and three stacks of small rocks that had been stacked up by somebody. I definitely felt weird at this point, but it was about this time that he found a small puddle full of baby salamanders and he wanted to catch them. It was honestly the happiest that I'd seen him in a very long time, and I didn't have the heart to tell him that it was time to go. We spent about an hour catching baby salamanders, and I watched him have the time of his life. Eventually, though, we finally decided to leave, and when we got to the platform dead center in the middle of the tree roots was a wet washcloth hanging that was absolutely not there before, and he noticed it as well but didn't pick up on the severity of the situation that we were in. At that moment, I factually knew two things. One, someone was definitely watching us and we didn't see them. And two, they were now potentially hiding in the woods and made it a point not to be seen but to leave an object to be noticed. There was no running back with a narrow trail, and I was not about to tell him that we were in potential danger. I told him to go in front of me, and I just kept encouraging him that he was doing great over and over, and that thankfully seemed to speed him up naturally. I never did see anyone while we were on that trail. We got to the car, and I locked the doors immediately once inside. And on our way out of the park, a very dirty man, probably in his 30s, I would guess, came out of the woods and made it a point to stare at me with the most empty of expressions that I had ever seen. The man followed me with his eyes in his head as I drove by him and continued to stare at me until I couldn't see him anymore. I knew the third fact at that point, that he had made it a point to make himself apparent to me, and that facts 1 and 2 were true. The stare stayed with me for days, and I even considered seeking counseling because it left me with a deep sense of unease. For weeks, it caused me severe anxiety, and I couldn't shake the feeling. I tried to convince myself that maybe we had just interrupted his bath or that he was camping and didn't want to startle us. After all, the strange man had plenty of time to do whatever he wanted while we were catching salamanders. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't rationalize why he would stare directly into my eyes the way he did if he really wanted to stay unnoticed. Deep down, I knew it was likely a deliberate move meant to frighten me. He had no idea how panicked I was at that moment. For him, it was one of the most fun experiences he'd ever had, and he talks about it regularly, still thinking of it as a positive adventure. But for me, it was one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had, and it left me feeling sick and disturbed. Moving on to the next story. I'd always dreamed of living alone, and after years of dealing with roommates and cramped apartments, I finally got my own place, a modest house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine. Surrounded by vast fields and the occasional cluster of trees, the house felt like a refuge, quiet, peaceful, and isolated. Everything I'd been craving. The first week was pure bliss. I spent my days arranging furniture, unpacking boxes, and marveling at the abundance of space. In the evenings, I'd relax with a book or a glass of wine, enjoying the tranquility and the feeling of being far from the hustle of the world. It was perfect until the third night. While I was closing the curtains in the living room, I noticed something outside. At the edge of the field, near the tree line, there was a faint figure. It was difficult to make out in the low light, just a dark silhouette against the pale grass. I squinted, trying to figure out if it was a person, but it didn't move. It stood there completely still. Probably just a scarecrow, I told myself, though I didn't remember seeing one earlier. Still, I shrugged it off and pulled the curtains shut. The next night, though, I saw it again. This time it seemed closer, maybe halfway across the field. A knot formed in my stomach as I stared at it. It still didn't move, no swaying in the breeze, no shifting limbs. Just a static, humanoid shape. I tried to shake off the growing unease, convincing myself it was just my imagination, or perhaps a trick of the light. Maybe it was a tree stump I hadn't noticed before. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. By the end of the week, it was only a few yards from the house. I stopped going near the windows after dark. During the day, I'd step outside looking for any signs of footprints or disturbances in the grass, but there was nothing. The field remained untouched, as if no one had ever been there. I started sleeping with the lights on now, every door locked and bolted. I even bought blackout curtains to block out the field completely, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. One night, I woke up suddenly. My room was bathed in faint moonlight, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. But then I saw it. It was standing at the foot of my bed. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was clearer now, no longer just a distant shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and a head that tilted unnaturally to one side. Its features were indistinct, like its face was hidden in shadow despite the moonlight pouring in through the window. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but my body refused to obey. It stood there motionless, just like it had in the field. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, but none came. This wasn't a dream. I could feel the cold sweat dripping down my back, the pounding of my heart in my chest. Then slowly it moved. Its head tilted further, the angle grotesque and unnatural. It leaned closer, and though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt its gaze pierce through me. A faint sound escaped its throat, a low guttural noise that sent shivers instantly down my spine. And then, well, I really don't remember much after that, because the next thing that I knew, it was morning. I was still in bed. The room flooded with sunlight now. The figure was gone, but that unease definitely lingered. I spent the day searching the house, looking for any sign that someone had been inside. Nothing was out of place. The doors were still locked, the windows closed, but I knew what I had seen, and deep down, I understood that it probably wasn't over. That night, I sat in the living room with every light on, gripping a kitchen knife. The hours dragged by, and the silence grew heavier. Midnight came and went, and I started to convince myself that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But then I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window behind me. In a burst of determination, I got up quickly and opened the blinds. But when I looked, there was nothing there. Since then, I've made the decision to leave. There's something here, something deeply wrong, and I can't stay any longer. Moving on to the next story. I've always considered myself a skeptic, and I'll probably always be one. Do I have ghost stories? Sure, but most of them can be easily explained by lighting or simple confusion. However, this particular experience is one that I've never been able to explain. It happened 5 years ago, so my memory of the details is a bit fuzzy, but I'm confident about what took place. I was at one of those school camps where they take you deep into the woods and you sleep in well-equipped cabins. The camp had a mix-up with the bookings, though, and ended up putting too many people in the cabin where my friends were staying. So I offered to switch to another cabin that had an available bed and went to sleep around the same time as the others in the room. But then I woke up in the middle of the night. It's a pretty common thing to wake up in the middle of the night, but the timing and what happened next are what really threw me off. So when I opened my eyes, I saw something that made no sense. Every bed in the room was completely empty. The sheets were flat, and there were no lumps, no sign of anyone being there at all. These girls were tall, and there was no way they could have disappeared under the covers without leaving a trace. I knew they had been there when I went to sleep, and it wasn't that the room was too dark to see. I could make out the beds perfectly, but they were completely flat. Naturally, I was confused, so I got up to check the beds more closely, but they were just as flat and empty as I thought. I wondered if maybe they all got up and left, so I decided to find them. I stepped out into the hallway, which was dark, and opened the door to my original room. To my surprise, all the beds in that room were occupied, and my friends were sound asleep. By this point, I was thoroughly puzzled, and I started thinking that maybe they had switched rooms to get away from me for some reason. So I woke everyone up kind of rudely and asked them about it. I was just trying to figure out what was going on, but once I got some answers, I returned to the hallway. But here's the second weird part. When I got back there was no door. Our room was the one at the end of the hallway. You couldn't miss it or confuse it with any other door, but instead I find myself staring at an empty wall. To be clear, I was having no issues seeing the other doors in the dark, but I end up opening the wrong dorm room again, and get yelled out only to turn around again and see a very clearly visible door at the end of the hallway. I was in the same position as before with no increase in vision or in clarity or anything. The door wasn't hard to see in the dark at all either. And when I enter, there are all my roommates also clearly visible as large lumps in the beds. It didn't even take me a second to notice them. They couldn't have left and come back either. I mean, I spent about 3 minutes in the hallway, the only entrance to the room, and about 2 minutes in the wrong dorm. And even if they had managed to sneak back in during the 2 minutes that I was in the other dorm, then all gotten into bed and gone to sleep in the next minute or two, I would have been able to hear them moving for sure. No one was making any noise since they were all tired, and the cabin had elevated wooden plank floors, which means that it was loud and any kind of footsteps echoed everywhere, and you could hear it. Can I be sure that it was really paranormal? Well, no. But I've never been able to figure out why any of this happened, where the people in the door went, why they came back like it was nothing. It couldn't have been visual issues because I had no issues seeing, like I said. The issue was that I could very clearly see completely empty beds though. To clarify things as well that I've been asked about by friends while talking about this, there were no windows in the room that were big enough for anyone to get out of, and doing so would have required moving something to stand on and then all of them jumping out of the window. That didn't even fit them, and landing on the ground without creating enough noise to wake me up or leaving something behind. They couldn't have been hiding anywhere either because I had the bottom bunk and could see the empty bottom of each bed. The room was pretty much empty other than that too. It also couldn't have had to do with sleep because it wasn't a dream. My friends in the other dorm all agreed on what had happened on their end just as I remembered it too. It couldn't have been sleepwalking either, as I was fully conscious and capable of thinking out full sentences and debating actions in my head and all of that. That's such a strange and unsettling experience, and I can totally understand why you're so puzzled by it. The memory being clear and vivid, not dreamlike, definitely rules out the possibility of a dream. The fact that you saw everything so clearly and could even check the other room makes it hard to explain as sleepwalking, especially since sleepwalkers typically don't remember the things they do. And the added detail that the teachers noticed you walking around, that suggests you were fully awake at the time. It's almost like you experienced some kind of glitch in reality, where time or perception didn't quite line up. You'd have definitely heard or seen your roommates if they had snuck out, so that rules out the idea of them leaving without you noticing. Plus, the fact that you could find them all asleep in the other room makes it even stranger, like there was some weird shift in what was happening around you. There's no clear, logical explanation for what you experienced, which leaves it in that eerie territory where it's just unexplainable. Maybe it was some kind of shared experience, or something beyond typical perception. Either way, it's definitely one of those incidents that sticks with you, especially when you can't make sense of it no matter how you look at it. Moving on to the next story. When I was 15, this happened to me. I'm female, by the way. To give you some context, I was living in a fairly large house located in a very safe and popular neighborhood. The house itself is significant to this story, so let me describe it a bit. There were 5 of us living there. My 17-year-old brother, my 17-year-old sister, my parents, and myself. On the ground floor, my sister had a spacious room that opened up to the garden through a large patio door. There was also a cozy room with computers, a TV, and some jewelry. 1 floor up from the ground, you find the living room, the kitchen, the first bathroom, and my parents' bedroom. The living room had a TV, and there was jewelry in the bathroom and my parents' room. My father also had some money hidden in the drawers, as he was planning to pay for some important work on our heating system in cash. It's a bit of an odd detail, I know, but I never asked him about it at the time. On the 3rd and final floor, there was my bedroom, my brother's bedroom, and the second bathroom with a sauna. And yes, I know it sounds pretty luxurious to have that set up, but where we lived, most houses had similar features. To be honest, we mostly used the sauna as a wine cave. Now, to get to the story. It wasn't a particularly dark or stormy night, just a regular evening, a little dark, but nothing unsettling. It was around 5 p.m., and by then, it was already pretty dark, as it tends to be in this country during the winter. My brother and sister weren't home that evening. They were off at school for a class, while my parents were in France handling some administrative matters. They had been gone for about a week at this point. I was the only one at home, and like any teenager, I was in my room with the rest of the house in complete darkness, just relaxing. I had my headphones on, watching a movie in bed, and the light in my room was on. It's important to mention that my window faced the street. Half an hour passed. An hour. I was still engrossed in my movie. Naturally, I couldn't hear anything happening around the house since the movie was on, but then I glanced up from the screen and saw the doorknob turning. It happened so quickly. I took off my headphones thinking it was my brother or sister, and the door opened. But instead of them, I found myself face to face with a young man, probably around 20. We stared at each other for a couple of seconds before he slammed the door as hard as he could. I jumped to my feet in a panic. I made the poor decision to open the door, and to my horror, I saw 3 men running down the stairs. I didn't know any of them, and I stood frozen in fear for about 5 to 10 minutes. Eventually, I go down the stairs to the kitchen where I can grab a knife. Slowly, I explore first my parents' room. It's a complete mess. There's drawers open, papers, clothes, everything. And there is the money. There's the jewelry. There's the TV, the computer, which was so weird to me because nothing had been taken. I proceed to the other parts of the house, calling for my brother and sister. They don't answer. I decide to call my best friend who speaks the country's language that we live in so that she can call the police for me. And the more that I proceed through the house, the more that it is an absolute mess. But again, nothing has been taken. Absolutely nothing. They broke through my sister's window patio door, and there was broken glass everywhere. But in her room, too, nothing was taken. The police arrived with dogs, and we eventually told our parents after everyone else had been informed. Unfortunately, they never managed to find the men. As a typical teenager, I took the chance to skip school the next day, although to be honest, I wasn't as traumatized as I probably should have been. At the time, I was more curious about what had just happened. But even now, it still bothers me. I mean, why would they break into a house when there's jewelry, money, and everything else easily accessible, but not take any of it? What was their reason for breaking in? What was their motive? It just doesn't make sense. Moving on to the next story. A few months ago, I experienced sleep paralysis for the first time, and it was one of the strangest things I've ever gone through. I'm in my 40s now, and although I've been sober for a long time, I did experiment with psychedelics and dissociatives back when I was younger. Having been through a lot of different altered states over the years, I can say that this was the most bizarre experience I've ever had. While I had always been curious to experience sleep paralysis, I was completely unprepared for what it would actually be like. It's a deeply alien and unique sensation, unlike anything else. It's like being trapped in a space where someone is constantly playing the loudest, most piercing violin music. The pressure, the sense of being utterly stuck, and the overwhelming fear. It all feels like a spiritual and mental maze with no way out. I was lying in bed, caught in that in-between space of wakefulness and sleep, fully aware of my surroundings, the gentle snoring of my cat, the hum of the oscillating fan, and the soft glow of my alarm clock. I was so close to slipping into sleep, yet not quite there. That's when I glanced toward my window and saw something that made my heart skip. A thin, grayish-green, veined arm reached in from the top left corner of the window. The skin was so thin, almost translucent, and the arm had long, pointed claws that dug into the wall to pull itself inside. Panic set in almost immediately, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just dreaming. It couldn't be real, right? After all, I'd always prepared myself for this moment. I had heard so many stories of sleep paralysis, and I was ready to face whatever came. But what crawled through the window was unlike anything I'd imagined. It wasn't just any creature, it was like something out of a nightmare, or maybe an alien, demon, or something even worse. It moved as though the world had tilted sideways, and it was crawling up into my room, like Spider-Man scaling the walls. It's moving in patchy, sort of jerking motions like it's operating in a different frame rate of reality, I guess. And just like that, it's standing at the base of my bed suddenly, down to the left, just out of reach, watching me. I could feel its gaze on me like a crushing lead-filled blanket. It was the most oppressive and terrifying thing that I've ever felt. And, I've run into a bear and large cats in the wilderness before and have been hit by a car even, but this was way worse. This 4-foot, bug-eyed, slender gray-green thing with talons just oozed fear along with this immense power. Waves of it just came from it and washed over me, and it was like it was purposefully projecting these onto me like an attack, and honestly, it was working. I keep trying to talk myself down because, this is not real. Like, you guys got me, but I know it's just a dream. Try again next time. And after a moment, it's no longer standing there. I'm in the clear. I think to myself, wow, what a weird experience. I can see why people think that this stuff is real. But then it happens. It was like the roof just suddenly fell on me, this immense force, and I see it at the base of the bed grabbing my ankles and trying to pull me out or something. It's snarling, and boy, has it got some pretty gnarly teeth. I can sense it wants to take me with it. I can feel those talons biting into my ankles. I try to fight back, but the thing's grip tightened, shifting and readjusting as if it had no intention of letting me go. And then, just as suddenly, I was awake. It was gone, but there was this lingering sensation, as if it had only just been there. What made this experience even worse was how incredibly real it felt, even after I woke up. The memory of it stayed with me, like an aftertaste, as if the creature was still out there somewhere. It felt like it could still be lurking, maybe hunting in some other realm, feeding, and knowing it could strike at any time. What could its prey do against something like that? It was as if there was no escape, no way to fully comprehend the danger once it was detected. Moving on to the next story. I was in grade 9 at this awful school, which was in a really bad part of town. The school system was a mess, and the area was known for being dangerous. Honestly, I didn't think much of it at the time since things like this happened all the time there. It was just part of the routine, but now that I'm reflecting on it, I realize how strange and unsettling it really was. It all happened during PE class, when we were jogging laps around the school on the sidewalk. I was with my usual group of 5 girls, and we were lagging behind as always, more interested in chatting about the latest school gossip than actually exercising. While we were walking and talking about the drama, a red truck pulled up beside us. This wasn't anything new. Creepy men in cars often slowed down near us when we were outside, but we didn't think anything of it. We just kept walking, trying to ignore the situation and keep our conversation going. We saw his truck 2 or 3 times more. He was driving around the school and slowing down every time that he passed by us, so we decided to tell our teacher that made us go back inside in the gym. We started playing whatever game that we were doing when the teacher came to me and told me that I was asked to the main office because someone was here to pick me up now. I was panicking because nobody was supposed to pick me up during class that day, and I thought that maybe something bad had happened to either my mom or my dad or somebody in my family. So I got changed into my normal clothes, grabbed my backpack, and rushed to the office. When I got there, the lady told me that there was a man waiting for me outside of the main doors. I got a little bit confused because usually when my parents came to pick me up, they would wait in the hall until I got there. I took a look throughout the glass door and saw an old man. I had never seen this man once in my life. I quickly walked back to the office and told the lady that I didn't know this man and that what she told me next froze me. She told me that he had said that he was a friend of my parents and that they had asked him to pick me up because my mother got into a car accident. He told the lady my name and my last name, my age, my mom's name, and the grade that I was in even. I was shocked and immediately asked her if I could call my parents to confirm. So I called my dad, and he told me that my mom was just fine and he was at work. The lady just told me to go back to class, and I never saw that man again. I never knew what happened after I left. How did he know all of that info about me? My parents talked to the cops about this, and there was never anything that came of it. We just never got any answers. Since that happened, I moved into a much safer city, and I hope that I never have to deal with anything like that ever again. Moving on to the next case. So I was standing out with my older brother, both of us smoking cigarettes outside of my parents' porch. My family and I grew up in a very superstitious part of the American Southwest. I guess you could say in a part of America where there is a very strong fear of skinwalkers. I know. Another skinwalker story, right? But what I witnessed alongside of my brother, honestly, it felt chillingly real. A few years before this incident, my older brother and I encountered something in our parents' backyard, so we've always been a bit on edge at night around our neighborhood, still am to this day. And we grew up in a culture that discourages people from wandering around at night without some sort of cultural blessing. But we were a few years older, smoking our cigarettes, catching up because my brother was attending college in the city and I was finishing up my junior year in high school. I was rambling on about something when I saw my brother's startled look out at our neighbor's yard. I looked over at what he was staring at and found myself looking at a shadow figure standing outside of our neighbor's house. It's difficult to describe this shadow as its figure was basically blacker than the night outside, the dim glow of the street lights, having an almost shadow radiance, if that makes any sense. But whatever it was standing on the side of our neighbor's house. And while I couldn't see its face, I just knew that it was staring at our neighbor's draped windows. My brother and I looked at each other with disbelief. I mean, we both heard the stories about skinwalkers roaming around at night. We both witnessed that sort of thing years ago, but it was only a glimpse followed by hearing the most otherworldly, horrifying howl that sounded both sort of human and animal. But this was different. It was like seeing something that we were never meant to see, something even more sinister than before. We said nothing to each other, turning our gaze back towards the figure, which was still staring at the neighbor's window. After what seemed like a long moment, the figure started to slowly turn and walk to our neighbor's backyard. But the way that it moved was a surreal sight. It looked to be both sort of moving slow and fast at the same time, like jogging in place, except it was gliding along. Then it moved towards a group of neighborhood dogs, and I knew that these were neighborhood dogs because I recognized almost every one of them under the dim tangerine backyard light, but they weren't scared by the shadow figure. In fact, they almost looked to be welcoming it. The dogs formed a crowd around the figure which stopped and, I swear to this day, morphed down onto all fours, sprang a back tail, and disappeared into the night with a group of neighborhood dogs following. I looked at my brother and asked, "What did you put into those cigarettes?" We both nervously chuckled, but we knew what we saw and we hurried back inside, making sure that we took our cigarette butts with us. Inside, our dad and youngest brother were asleep, but our mom was still up. We told our mother what had happened, and she instructed us to go outside to get some wood to burn. She smeared ash on our foreheads, and we ventured outside to gather some firewood. While walking towards the woodpile, we noticed that our street light, which was on when we were heading back inside after stamping in our cigarettes, was now out, the only street light out in the entire neighborhood. We saw it as a sign of something being around, and we hurried to gather the wood. Right when we were about to head inside, we could smell it, the strong, putrid scent of a dead animal. We knew right there, and then that we were in the middle of those stories that we'd heard about skinwalkers. We didn't stop to investigate further, so we hurried back to the house and immediately built a fire. We told our mom about the strange smell we'd encountered outside, and she marched out with a fresh tin of ash, determined to confront whatever it was. She shouted in both English and her native language, telling it to leave us alone, insisting we hadn't done anything to provoke it. She followed the traditional rituals, invoking the power of Jesus Christ, and sprinkled ash on the front and back porches. She also placed a bow and arrow above the back door as a protective gesture. That night, we slept peacefully, without any more strange occurrences. But months later, when I moved to a city to live with my older brother for the summer, I received a call from my mom. She told me that the neighbor who lived in the house where we'd seen the shadow figure had passed away from cancer. I'm not sure if it's just a coincidence, but whatever we encountered that night still gives me chills to think about. Moving on to the next story. Years ago, I had a close friend from high school. We instantly bonded over our shared interests: movies, games, activities, and so much more. This friend owned a lovely cottage in Muskoka, located just over an hour from where we lived. They often talked about how amazing it was to visit in the summer, especially with the river nearby, perfect for swimming, paddleboarding, and other fun activities. They also casually mentioned that the place might be haunted. They joke about hearing strange noises at night and suggested it might be home to a ghost. It was always said in a light-hearted way, so we'd laugh off the idea of their almost new cottage being haunted. A few years later, my friend invited me to join their family at the cottage in October. I was thrilled since I'd never been to Muskoka, and I knew how beautiful it was, particularly in the fall. Plus, my friend often raved about how much fun they had at the cottage. I should mention that up until this point, I had never experienced anything paranormal myself. I didn't disbelieve in it, but I never found myself in a situation where I could say, yes, that's definitely paranormal, until this trip. We arrived at the cottage in a small community called Matthiasville. As soon as we crossed the bridge that led into the area, I felt this strange, almost oppressive sensation, like a shadow had been cast over me. The day had been sunny and filled with good vibes until that point, but once we entered the community, the weather suddenly turned overcast. It wasn't just the weather, though. There was something heavy in the air, an unsettling energy. As we drove along the riverside, I mentioned the weird feeling to my friend, who casually agreed, saying, "Oh, I know. It's strange, right? Kind of heavy." Things felt a little lighter after that, but there was still an odd energy in the air. When we finally arrived at the cottage, it was stunning. A new build with 3 floors, a large deck on the second floor, and huge windows from floor to ceiling. The view overlooked the river, and behind the cottage, there was a dense forest trail that seemed impossible to navigate due to the thick brush and overgrown woods. So we spent most of our time relaxing by the water or hanging out on the big deck. During the day, we made trips to Bracebridge, the nearest town, and at night, we dedicated ourselves to playing the Call of Duty World at War campaign in split screen. It was a fantastic time. We took a long walk through Matthiasville, checking out some of the interesting sights, like a large dam, and further along, a small, eerie graveyard situated on a slight hill at the edge of the community. The graves were old, some unmarked, and others were so worn down you couldn't make out what was written on the stones. It was a bit unsettling, but nothing out of the ordinary happened during the first 2 nights, so I figured it was just a normal part of the area. On the third and final night, my friend's dad had to head home early for work, so it was just my friend, their mom, and me left. The mom was staying in the loft on the 3rd floor, while we claimed the basement for the weekend. After watching a movie and snacking, I suggested we take a night walk. It was a clear night with a big moon, and I loved going for late night strolls. Plus, we hadn't really explored the area after dark, and I thought it would be beautiful under the moonlight. My friend, however, was adamantly against the idea. They said that the place was spooky enough during the day, let alone at night, but I managed to convince them, and so out we went. We were walking along the road that went along the river towards the dam and the end of the community where the graveyard was. We made it about a quarter of the way when my friends stopped dead in their tracks. I looked back to see what was up, and they were just sort of standing there, and they looked defensive. I asked what was up, and they said, "We need to go back like now. This feels weird, and I don't like it at all." I asked if they were scared, like if they heard an animal or something. And as soon as I asked that, we heard what I can only describe as a deep and loud crackling and snapping of wood in the dense forest above us on a rocky ridge that was beside the road, opposite side of the river. I looked up to where we heard it, and it suddenly felt like everything just hushed. Crickets and all other nighttime sounds seemed to have just completely stopped. My friend quietly said my name. I looked back at them, and then suddenly the bushes and the shrubs underneath the ridge on the other side of the road just exploded as if something huge jumped in them and thrashed around. This made us bolt, and I remember just saying run as I followed behind my friend. We ran non-stop straight to the basement door of the cottage. We got there in minutes, but it felt like seconds. We ran straight into the basement bedroom, and we both hopped into the bed. I remember saying that it was likely a coyote or a raccoon or something, but as soon as I said those words, a creaking started forming up above us in the living area of the first floor. The creaking soon turned into slow, heavy footsteps back and forth and loud as if someone was wearing work boots or something. I remember my friend through tears saying, "Does that sound like a coyote to you?" I cannot even describe the absolute feeling of dread that just suddenly washed over me, like there was something up there taunting us. We lay in complete silence for what felt like hours. We got into the bed at around 3 a.m. after our walk, which turned into a run, and the footsteps didn't stop for an hour or so at least. Eventually, I remember finally falling asleep at about 6 in the morning. When we woke up, the first thing that we did, of course, was ask the mom if she had been awake last night at around 3 a.m., and she assured us that she wasn't. She hadn't even gotten up once to use the bathroom, she said. Even though she could have gotten up, we should have been able to hear her door open and her footsteps coming down the stairs from the loft. The entire first floor was open concept, so any movement up there would have been easily audible. After that night, we packed up and left, and my friend's parents ended up selling the cottage a couple of years later. I don't think any of them went back after that weekend. I did some research on the area afterward, and I discovered that it had once been the site of a sawmill where a tragic accident occurred. I believe the owner's son either drowned or was involved in a serious accident at the mill. I can't say for certain if that has anything to do with the strange occurrences, but who really knows? What I do know is that night, I clearly heard heavy footsteps pacing around above us on the first floor. It's an experience that I'll never forget, my first and only paranormal encounter. Moving on to the next story. This is something I honestly never thought I'd share. I've never really believed in ghosts. I'm 26, and in my entire life, I've never experienced anything paranormal. But recently, my wife and I have been noticing some really strange things happening in our house. Just 2 nights ago, my wife was asleep in our daughter's room while I was in the master bedroom. I woke up around 1:30 a.m. to grab a late-night snack. While I was in the kitchen, my wife came in and asked, "What, babe?" I was totally confused and asked what she meant. She told me she had heard the doorknob move really hard, so much so that she thought it was locked and I was trying to open it. She seemed annoyed, but I reassured her I hadn't done anything. I assumed she was just dreaming or perhaps heard me opening cookies, so I didn't think much of it at the time. But then, just a couple of hours later, my wife and my sister-in-law were in my daughter's room. I was cleaning the living room when she came out to check on me. They both thought I was playing a prank on them because the door handle had moved 3 times in a row, and they both saw it happen. It took me at least 30 minutes to convince them that I hadn't touched the door. Later, my wife saw it happen again while we were searching the house, and we were all sure no one else was inside. A few months ago, there were 2 separate instances where my daughter's toys in her room started making noise nonstop for at least an hour. I was too scared to turn them off or even move, especially since it was around 2 in the morning, and I was the only one in the living room. It didn't make sense, so I ended up waking my wife to help me. We pulled the batteries out, but like I said, I'm not a believer in paranormal stuff. However, now I'm starting to question everything. I mean, I've thought about all possible explanations for the doorknob moving, but there's just no way it could do that on its own. So what could it be? When I was about 9 years old, I used to sneak out at night to walk around my neighborhood. I know it sounds strange, but I was a weird kid, always watching scary videos on YouTube. Despite shaking with fear, I couldn't stop myself. My neighborhood is filled with abandoned houses, many left untouched since the war in 1995. I'm from Bosnia. I always wanted to explore those houses, but I was too shy and scared to go alone, especially because I worried about someone catching me and giving me a weird look. That's when I discovered this huge house, surrounded by overgrown grass taller than me. I'd asked my mom to go with me, but she refused and banned me from it. One night, though, I grabbed my dad's flashlight, climbed through my window like I'd done before, and decided to explore the house myself. It was midnight. I arrived quickly as it was only a few houses from mine. Seeing no cars, I ran through the tall grass and ended up seeing a boarded up window. There was a tight gap that I managed to crawl through, and I entered the house. And to my surprise, the room that I was in had nothing in it, like literally nothing, not even a beer bottle or a cigarette. The house had no real windows or doors, so I could hear a sort of hissing sound of the wind. I walked around for a bit, and I realized that there was nothing really special about it, and that I probably should have just stayed in bed. But while I was walking around, I would stop sometimes because I could have sworn that I heard somebody else walking in there, like the walking of heavy boots on stone or something. I froze thinking that there was somebody in the house with me. I stood frozen for 5 minutes, and when I could no longer hear the sound, I continued to the second floor. The first room that I saw on the second floor was the bathroom. It had a toilet broken in half and a bathtub filled with dirty water. On the floor of it, I spotted something metal. I continue walking, and I see an attic like a hole in the roof of the house leading somewhere. There was a ladder nearby, and as I went to get it, I saw something small, like really small, like sort of a lighter sprinting across the room. I stood there, and as a kid, of course, I started to cry a little bit. I can't really explain what I saw, but it didn't look like a bug or a rat, but more like a humanoid creature. As I started crying, I sprinted to the window as quickly as I could that I came through. Looking behind me, I could make out a silhouette as well, like a man holding something. I jumped for the gap, and while trying to get out, I heard a huge bang, like from a gunshot or something. I quickly sprinted back to my house, crawled back through the window, and went straight to bed. But I couldn't sleep for nights after that experience. Eventually, my mom took me to the doctor, but they said nothing was wrong. Years later, I brought up the story to my mom again. She laughed at me, but then told me something that sent chills down my spine. During the war between the Serbs and the Bosniaks, that house had been used by the Serbs as a slaughterhouse. It's estimated that over 200 Bosniaks were killed there. When my mom told me that, I went straight to my room, barely able to comprehend it. The metal thing I had found in the house was probably a bullet shell. To this day, I don't know if there was someone actually in that house or if something paranormal was happening, but either way, I'm just glad I left when I did. Moving on to the next story. I grew up in a tiny town with only about 1,000 people. There wasn't much to do, so my friends and I spent a lot of time walking around during the spring and summer. Our town was small, but it sat right on Route 2, a major highway that stretches for 2,571 miles across the northern U.S. While it was a quiet town, we often saw out-of-state cars driving through. I was about 13 or 14 years old when I was walking along Route 2 on my way to my best friend's house. There was a wide pull-off area along the road where I was walking, and a man on a blue motorcycle with a matching helmet pulled into it. I could only see his eyes through the helmet, but he seemed kind and had a soft, non-threatening voice. He looked fairly young, probably in his 20s or early 30s if I had to guess. I remember the conversation very well, even though I hadn't thought about it much over the years. I remember him being both flattered and a bit naive, I suppose. When he pulled up, he asked me where the nearest bridge was. I told him there was one about 7 miles north in the next town, or roughly 20 miles back in the direction he had come from. He thanked me and then started complimenting me, saying how pretty I was before asking if I wanted to grab lunch with him. I thanked him for the compliment and mentioned that I was on my way to a friend's house. But he kept insisting for quite a while, probably around 5 minutes, talking about how much fun we'd have and how he didn't know the area well, so he could use my help finding a place to eat. I tried to be polite while repeatedly reminding him that I had other plans. He pointed out that he only had one helmet, but then quickly suggested that I could wear his for a short ride, promising to bring me right back into town after we ate and that it wouldn't take long at all. He finally gave up when I pointed out my friend's bright blue house, which was only about a block away, and told him that she and her family were expecting me any minute. That was partly true, though not entirely. She knew I was coming that day, but I never gave her a set time. I just told her I'd walk over whenever I woke up. Since I usually slept in late during the summer, she wouldn't have been expecting me just yet. Her mom was out on the porch, smoking as usual, but with her back turned toward us, she hadn't noticed the interaction. However, I could see her, which gave me a sense of reassurance. She would have absolutely been there fighting off this man in a heartbeat if he had actually tried forcing me onto his bike. All I would have had to have done was yell for her, and she would have been there. I thought that I was invincible at the time, and so grown up. I thought that I was tough and that nobody would ever harm me. Like I said, I remember being very flattered, which is really stupid of me. I know, but I remember thinking how fun it sounded and that I would get to ride on a motorcycle for the first time. At one point, I actually considered getting on the stranger's bike because I felt invincible and thought it might be exciting. The only thing that stopped me was the thought of how furious my parents would be if they ever found out. Looking back, I realized they wouldn't have been angry at all, just incredibly relieved if I had gone and made it back safely. It's strange how the mind works when you're young, but in the end, I'm just grateful that my fear of upsetting them kept me from making that decision. It may have actually saved my life. Thinking about it now, there's no way he didn't realize I was just a kid. I was still in that awkward phase and looked every bit my age at the time. But what unsettles me the most is how persistent he was, asking for directions to the nearest bridge and repeatedly trying to get me to come along. In just 7 minutes, he could have crossed state lines, and no one would have even noticed I was missing until much later that day. Moving on to the next story. I'll do my best to describe what I saw, though it's hard to capture the exact image. I was driving across the country with my mom, and we had just crossed into California from Arizona a little before 11 p.m. The area was rural, with a few other cars on the road, but I wouldn't call it heavy traffic. As I was driving, I noticed something glowing off to the right, just slightly off-road and at ground level. It had a fluorescent neon dark blue color, very bright, but strangely, it didn't illuminate anything around it. It wasn't just glowing, though. It had a distinct shape, almost like an energy cell from a futuristic movie or video game, around 5 feet tall and 2 feet wide, with ribbed sides. Then I realized it wasn't just sitting there, it was moving, and in a way that felt completely unnatural. It moved in a way that made it seem like it was glued to the ground, tracing the slight hills and dips of the terrain. It was almost as if it were attached to some kind of off-road vehicle that was magnetically locked to the surface it was moving on. After a few seconds, it lifted slightly and then vanished into the ground. Almost immediately, 2 small spotlights appeared in the air right where it had disappeared. These lights moved quickly, similar to the spotlights you see during big arena events, but they didn't project very far. They seemed to be trapped within some kind of invisible dome, unable to shine past it. The beams bounced around erratically inside this space, brighter than the rest of the dome, but never escaping its boundaries. It was pitch dark, so I couldn't make out anything else. No ground, no surroundings, just the strange lights. As I kept driving, my mom and I tried to process what we had just seen. It all felt completely unnatural. Then, barely 5 seconds later, my mom suddenly screamed. "What the heck is that?" I didn't see what she was looking at, but she described something eerily similar to what people online call black stick men, except this time, they were on the left side of the road. The figures were on the opposite side of the road from where we had seen the glowing neon light dome, and by then, we had already covered about 5 seconds worth of distance at 65 miles per hour. My mom described them as being around 12 feet tall, built like stick figures or people on stilts, though she couldn't make out any distinct features. Later, I came across a story online that described their movement exactly as my mom did, sort of lolloping with a bouncing or waddling gait. At first, she saw just one walking, but then another appeared nearby, and they seemed to be moving toward each other. At that point, I didn't hesitate. I floored the gas and got out of there as fast as I could. I mean, no way was I sticking around for whatever that was. I hadn't thought quickly enough to take a video of the glowing blue dome, but honestly, I'm kind of glad I didn't. Something about it gave me the feeling that recording it wouldn't have ended well. I don't know why, but I can't shake the theory that the blue light was connected to the government in some way, maybe even tracking or going after those things. I really don't know. Later, we also noticed flashing lights in the sky, moving way too close together to be normal aircraft. They were far off in the distance, though, so I wrote them off as border patrol drones or something similar. As for everything else we saw that night, I have no idea what to make of it. All I know is that nothing about it felt natural. Moving on to the next story. I want to start by saying that I always try to find a scientific or logical explanation for anything strange I experience. But this particular event left me absolutely terrified, and I've struggled to come up with any reasonable explanation. I work as a care provider, helping manage homes for the people we assist. One of my clients was a man in his 50s, though his declining health made him appear much older. Most people assumed he was in his late 70s or 80s. This detail is important. Every time I entered his home, I felt an overwhelming sense of discomfort. The best way to describe it is just a heavy, uneasy vibe. I would suddenly feel deeply anxious or depressed, as if the entire atmosphere of the house was pressing down on me. I've worked with many different clients all over my city, going in and out of all kinds of homes, but I had only ever felt something similar once before, years ago. Even then, it was nowhere near as intense as this. The whole place felt oppressive, like a weight I couldn't shake whenever I was inside. I just hated being there by myself because of it too. But a few months ago, I started realizing that I was remembering the vibe felt familiar from the other home from years before. As I sat in the kitchen on my laptop one afternoon, I started doing some research on the property to see if I could find any information on its history. Nothing unusual for it, just an older building from what I could find. I also started texting my sister if she ever got that uncomfortable vibe in the other house that I mentioned earlier, because she had also worked there as well. Once I started texting and narrowing down my internet search to see if I could find any information on if anyone had ever passed away or worse in the home, it was like the house knew that I was doing this. The air became heavy. All of the normal hummings of the electric appliances amped up to an uncomfortable loud buzz, and I had to cover my ears because I felt like they were going to pop from the pressure change. The lights overhead got brighter and buzzed as well, and I immediately shut my laptop and left the room. I told my sister that I would have to get back to her because I was done with even thinking about this as to not agitate whatever took notice. A couple of months passed, and while nothing major happened, that uncomfortable feeling never went away. My client's health kept declining, and earlier this year, he had to move into more intensive care. One day, I went back to his house to grab some of his belongings and paperwork. It was supposed to be a quick visit, just in and out. But as I was leaving and pulling the door shut behind me, I caught a glimpse across the main room into the kitchen. For a split second, I saw what I can only describe as a dark silhouette figure, quickly ducking out of sight. But I saw it. I knew without a doubt that I was completely alone in that house. Without even thinking, I just shut the door and walked away, not daring to look back. I still don't know what I experienced there, but it felt like whatever it was didn't want to be noticed. The most unsettling part of all of this is the thought that stuck with me ever since. That thing might have been feeding off my client's life force. He had moved in just a few years prior, but his health had deteriorated so quickly, making him look decades older than he actually was. I won't go into details about his condition, but it was eerie how someone so relatively young could have aged and declined that fast. Moving on to the next story. First off, I just want to say that whether you believe me or not doesn't really matter to me. I just want to share my experience for those who might be interested. Today, I had my second hypnoregression session to revisit my alien abduction when I was 6 years old. I thought I had a clear picture of what happened after my first session, but I was wrong. This time, I remembered everything. During this second session, I was able to face the entire experience without fear. I recall them taking me, their massive ship, the transport hangar, the human-like beings, the different crafts, the bed, the tracker, and the box. Every detail came back. I was 6 years old at the time, and this happened somewhere between February 2001 and February 2002 in Washington State, USA. I remember a blinding white light suddenly filling my entire room, illuminating everything around me. Then I remember seeing two figures suddenly appear in my room, standing near my window. A powerful voice echoed in my mind, saying, "Come with us." The next thing I knew, I was floating, drifting upward through the roof of my house, completely weightless. Below me, I could see the entire city, and I was overwhelmed with a mix of emotions: bliss, confusion, fear, and excitement, all at once. It was a feeling I'll never forget. I remember entering a massive white room, filled with bright lights. Lining the walls were small, silver, orb-like crafts, each with small fin-like structures around the bottom edges, maybe 5 or 6 in total. At that moment, panic took over. I bolted out of the room and into a hallway, frantically pushing past what I assumed were adults. I could hear them gasp in surprise as I shoved through. That's when I ran up to a large window. Desperate to understand where I was, I peered outside, and all I saw was space with Earth far below. Fear took hold, and I turned to run again, only to stumble into another group of these beings. One of them stood up, looking at me in surprise, and said, "Whoa, you're not supposed to be up here." They grabbed me, soothed me with this weird sort of sensation of being under a waterfall of smoke that tingles the entire body as it washes over you. They said that their name was Eric and held me there until 2 smaller people showed up. At this point, I think they did something to me because I couldn't move. I remember being floated or carried back down this hallway and into this large room with a strange brown light that glowed in the whole room. They laid me down into a bed, and that's where this large mantis-like being was there wearing some kind of a robe or a coat. I know it sounds really weird, but I remember being scared, a bit somehow okay with it, but I had this warm sort of hazy feeling still. I remember being held down by my hands and wrists, and it hurt a lot. The mantid told me that it was so that I wouldn't run away, but that they'll help take the pain away, and they did. I distinctly remember the pain went away after that. Next, I remember it turned on a bright overhead light in the room, turned my head to the left, and put a large sort of cylindrical needle or syringe thing behind my right ear, and then everything just went completely white and fuzzy. They said that it was a tracker, and it was so that they could watch me. They told me that it was all part of the plan so that they could study and preserve humans for the future. They told me that I'm supposed to be a teacher and that my purpose is in the future of this world. Next, I remember being taken by these 2 smaller beings into an adjacent room where they gave me this, small box. When I opened it, it exploded in a fountain of light, and inside the light, I saw screens with pictures of trees, mountains, the river, memories, numbers, letters, people walking, symbols, and all kinds of things. But most of all, it showed me my previous life. And to be honest, I really don't know what to think of this. So I would really like some help. In this box, this previous life, these beings show me the house I lived at, how I lost my family of a wife and 2 kids, and how it ultimately led to my all-consuming sorrow and the taking of my own life. If anyone knows a Marcus Peterson who had a wife and 2 kids that were about 10 and 6, give or take a few years, died in a car accident, and Mark took his own life. We lived in a small house on a piece of land surrounded by trees. The front porch had a small roof covering it, with a screen door and a brown wooden front door. After everything that happened, they eventually brought me back to a large hangar-like area. From there, they floated me down into my room, once again surrounded by that blinding white light. I remember being gently placed back onto my bed. As they turned to leave, I could feel them saying, "We'll be seeing you again soon," and then they were gone. And that's it. That's the whole experience. If you have any thoughts on what I should do now, I'd love to hear them. Moving on to the next story. When I was a child, probably around 7 or 8 years old, though it might have been as late as 10 or 11, I spent my summers at a country house. I can't recall the exact age, but I do remember that one night, my family and I were reclining on deck chairs arranged in a loose circle, gazing up at the night sky in search of shooting stars. It must have been August, and we were simply sitting there, taking in the view. At one moment, I noticed a bright moving across the star-filled sky at a steady pace. It wasn't extremely fast, but it had a certain determination and confidence in its movement, if that makes sense. It reminded me of the planes I often saw during the day, the ones that left a trail behind them and traveled faster than regular commercial flights. However, this particular object left no trace at all. It was like a star, except it was moving swiftly across the sky. With the knowledge I have now, I might say it was a satellite. But the strange thing is that at one point, this satellite suddenly stopped, right in front of a star, almost as if it were using it as cover. Then, within a few seconds, it moved toward another nearby star, completely breaking the kind of straight trajectory that an object like a plane or a satellite should follow. It repeated this maneuver 3 or 4 times, maybe even more, always positioning itself in front of a star as if it were hiding. At that moment, I had the eerie sensation of being watched, as if this object was aware of our presence and deliberately concealing itself behind the stars we were looking at. I also clearly remember my aunt exclaiming in disbelief, asterisk, but how is it doing that? It's impossible. Asterisk. Today, though, I seem to be the only one who remembers it. Because of this, I've often wondered if it might have been a dream, especially since the whole experience had a surreal quality to it. I tend to have unusual dreams, but none that stay so vividly in my mind for years unless I write them down. And I never wrote this one down. Yet, despite that, this memory has remained as sharp and clear as any real experience, standing the test of time in a way that dreams usually don't. Plus, my family does remember us sitting outside that night, watching the stars. So at least that part is certain. Just a few days ago, I was talking to a friend, and she told me she had the exact same experience when she was around 20 years old. She's absolutely convinced it wasn't a dream. She was with a friend at the time and saw the same kind of phenomenon in the sky, but over a beach in Sicily. I, on the other hand, saw it in the countryside near Palermo, on the opposite side of the region. The only difference between our experiences was the movement of the lights. Hers followed slightly curved, irregular paths, while mine moved in perfectly straight lines. Moving on to the next story. I'm a 20-year-old woman working at a notoriously rough prison in the South. It's a male facility, and we're ranked as the second most violent in the region. I work the midnight shift from 12 a.m. to around 8:30 a.m. One of my assignments is a dorm that people always claim was haunted, but I never gave it much thought. It's actually the best dorm in the compound, so I figured the ghost stories were just meant to scare me. However, a few months ago while working there, I started to feel uneasy, like I was constantly being watched. It wasn't as bad as some of the other dorms, but the feeling lingered. By 2:30 a.m., all the inmates were locked in their cells, and that unsettling sensation hadn't gone away. I went out to do a security check and make my rounds. When I reached the fourth wing, I felt the same awful sensation I always get when working there. But that night, something was different. I went upstairs and suddenly had no recollection of where I was or how I'd gotten there. It was unsettling since I had never experienced anything like that before. It felt as if I had completely lost the last 5 minutes of my memory. I was obviously confused and uneasy, but I didn't panic. Instead, I left the wing and tried to process what had just happened. I couldn't even remember leaving the officer station. In the end, I continued with my shift, though the strange feeling never really went away. A few weeks later, I was assigned to the same wing again. It was around 3 a.m., and I had to wake people up for their medication. I got everyone up with my sergeant, and she left to go to the pill window. We had a fight happen on the compound, so no movement until it was over. So I tell everyone to go to Wing 1 and sit down until they can go, because they're all older and have walkers. I noticed, though, that I started hearing a noise like a plastic lawn chair being dragged around. And I was like, wait, who's making that noise? I checked on the people waiting, and everyone was sitting in the wing. I looked around to see if anyone was up, but I didn't see a single person, and all the doors were locked. My staff bathroom is downstairs, near the door leading out, so I walked down to check if anyone was there. That's when I suddenly realized the noise was coming from inside my bathroom. I stood still and watched the bottom of the door for a moment. Then I saw a light pass underneath it. At that point, I thought, nope, and went back upstairs, deciding to wait for my coworker to return. When they finally did, we checked the bathroom together. The plastic trash can, which should have been in its usual spot, was now sitting in the middle of the floor. And I can say for sure, there was no one down there. This was just one of my many strange experiences working night shifts at the prison. But honestly, it's the one that unsettled me the most. Moving on to the next story. I live in Sacramento, California, where the state fair takes place every summer. When I was in my late teens, my friend and I, both female, decided to go together. Parking cost $10, and since we were being cheap, we chose to park across the street. Well, actually, a few streets deep from across the street, since plenty of other people had the same idea. The fair itself was the usual mix of excitement and chaos, and we had a decent time. Around 10 p.m., we decided it was time to leave. The fair was glowing with lights and filled with chaos, but the farther we walked away and the deeper we ventured into the back streets across from it, the darker it became and the fewer people we saw. My friend joked, asterisk, maybe I should get my mace out, just in case. Asterisk, we both laughed because at different times our families had given us mace for safety. But being young and reckless, we felt invincible. Since my friend was the one driving, she slowed down while rummaging through her purse for her keys, while I walked a few feet ahead of her. Just then, the fair's fireworks started going off, and I turned around to watch, walking backward as I did. At that exact moment, as I passed by a creepy gray van, a man suddenly jumped out from behind it, grabbed me tightly with both arms, and started lifting me off the ground. Instantly, my friend rushed forward and sprayed mace directly in his face. She managed to do this because, by pure luck, the mace was attached to her keychain, the one she had just pulled out of her purse. Some of it accidentally got in my eyes, and the pain was unbearable. But even through the burning, I managed to crack my eyes open just enough to see a cloud of mace hanging in the air in front of the man's face. His eyes were wide open, almost like the mace had no effect on him at all. Then, in an eerily calm and unsettling voice, he simply said, asterisk, I was just looking at her. Asterisk. We both screamed, and he let me go. Without wasting a second, we sprinted to her car and got the hell out of there. The strange thing is, we didn't even go straight to the police that night. At the time, I wasn't sure if what happened was serious enough to report. Now that I'm in my 40s, I know without a doubt that it was, and my true crime-obsessed self is frustrated that I didn't immediately contact the authorities. The next day, as I dealt with red, swollen eyes from the mace, I tried calling the non-emergency line to report it. But after being placed on hold and not taken seriously, I eventually gave up and moved on. Then, about a week later, I saw a news report about a man wanted by police, someone who had been lurking around the American River trails, the same area where the fair was held. He had been abducting women, taking them into his van, and, well, you can probably guess the rest. I still wonder what would have happened if my friend hadn't been there that night. Would I even be here today? I've never been so grateful to be maced in the face. Ladies, and honestly, men too, always carry mace or some kind of self-defense tool. The world can be unpredictable and terrifying, and you never know when you might need it. Moving on to the next story. This all started about a month ago when I was house-sitting for my brother while he and his wife were away on an anniversary trip. I was only staying the night and ended up falling asleep on their couch. It just felt weird to sleep in their bed. There wasn't a blanket on the couch and I couldn't find one, but when I woke up, I had one draped over me. I asked my mom if she had stopped by and cover me up since my brother's place is only about 5 minutes from her house. She said no. She was too tired to drive there that night. A few days later, I mentioned it to my sister-in-law, and that's when she told me something unsettling. Apparently, my 3-year-old nephew had been saying he saw a skinny person walking around the house, except, of course, no one was actually there. I started calling it Toby because that's the name of the demon in Paranormal Activity, and my mom called it Red Rum. Now, my name is Joseph, and my nephew who can't speak well always calls me Jorbis. This is important because last week I was taking him to the local arcade, and he went to my brother asking him for quarters yelling out Jovies Jovies, and I was walking behind him, and I heard clear as day a woman whisper Jovies as I was walking past the living room. Seriously, it sounded as if it was whispered right in my ear. And I mean, it couldn't have been my sister-in-law because she was on the other side of the house and no one was near me besides my nephew. Finally, my sister-in-law mentioned that one night, she and my brother woke up to the sound of a golf ball dropping in their kitchen. Thinking it might be my nephew playing, since he loves playing with golf balls, she went to check. But when she got there, there was no golf ball in sight. In fact, there was nothing around that could have made the noise. She then told me to take back whatever I did because she's worried it could be a demon. My brother, on the other hand, is the classic horror movie husband who doesn't take it seriously at all. Their house is small and pretty old, but as far as I know, no one has ever died there. I have no idea what's going on. It's just weird. And honestly, I don't know what to do about it. Thanks for watching. If these stories kept you on edge, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next chilling tale. See you in the next video.